The binding power of a covenant. The Gibeonites. In 2 Samuel 21 verse 1, we read, "Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. Now David was a wise and sensible king, so he asked the Lord, 'Why has this happened?' And the Lord answered him and said, 'It is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites.'" Now you may ask, what was so special about that? Because King Saul had killed thousands during his reign. So to get an answer to this question, we have to go back in time, from Samuel's books back to Joshua, about 400 years earlier. An event took place. But to understand that fully, we have to go even further back in time to the book of Exodus, when Moses was in the Sinai desert. And the Lord commanded Moses that when they were to invade Canaan's land, they were to kill all the inhabitants who dwelt there. In Deuteronomy 7:16, God said, "Also, you shall destroy all the peoples whom the Lord your God delivers over to you. Your eye shall have no pity on them." And in the book of Exodus, God said, "Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite." Now the Gibeonites were Amorites. And then he came with a warning. He said, "Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst." Now we can go forward in time, from the time of Moses in the Sinai desert, in the book of Exodus, to the time of Joshua, when he had newly arrived in Canaan's land. And this was still 400 years before David. So when the kings in Canaan heard about the miracles God had done for Israel in Egypt, how they crossed the Red Sea, the River Jordan, conquered Jericho and Ai, and killed everyone there except Rahab and her house, they were afraid. But the Gibeonites were smart. They had a plan, a good idea. In Joshua 9:4, we read, the Gibeonites, worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors, and they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins, torn and mended. And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country. Now, therefore, make a covenant with us." And Joshua believed him. In verse 15, so Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the rulers of the congregation swore to them. But they did not ask counsel of the Lord. Approximately 400 years later, God still reckons that covenant as binding, even although it was against his command. So this is how God looks on covenants. Now we can go forward in time, even more, from the time of Joshua back to the time of Samuel, which is about 400 years after Joshua. When God answered David concerning bloodthirsty King Saul, he went to the Gibeonites. And in 2 Samuel 21:3, we read, "Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, 'What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?' The Gibeonites answered in verse 6, 'Let 7 men of King Saul's descendants be delivered to us.' So David did that. In verse 9, and he, that is David, delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites. and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So they fell, all 7 together, and were put to death. David reconciled Israel with the Gibeonites so they could be blessed by them and terminate the famine. This shows the binding power of a covenant. So what relevance does that have for us today? Jesus made a covenant with his disciples, the New Covenant or the New Testament, which was inaugurated at the Last Supper just before Jesus was betrayed. We read in Mark 14:22-24, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many." This covenant is at least just as binding as the one we have just studied, since it was Jesus himself who made it. Now, the main purpose of the new covenant, we read in John 10:28, "And I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand." But note that this does not mean once saved, always saved. No one can snatch us out of God's hand, but we, because of our free will, can turn our backs on God and walk away.